So you can, therefore, as an ectotherm, you can live in habitats where there's, less food. You can live in habitats where food is seasonally scarce. So this low metabolic rate, coupled with this low energy requirement, also allows ectotherms to be pretty tiny, right? They can live in really small, they can live as really small organisms and therefore exploit really small niches that an endotherm wouldn't be able to exploit. So for example, living in the crack of a bark of a tree, right? So those small shelters, exploiting those small food resources, those are possible for ectotherms because of the sort of cheap living that they have. For endotherms, right, now we're talking about birds and mammals. And so one of the, so the sort of basic characteristics here, we're talking about homeothermy, which we've mentioned before. So maintain a constant body temperature across a wide range of environmental conditions, right, compared to ectotherms. Ectotherms, which often tend to be poikilothermic, which is variation in temperature of the body, which we talked about last time. Okay, so they're homeotherms. They're also endotherms. So that means they use energy from their own metabolism, that is from food, that's their fuel, to regulate body temperature. So this allows them to be more independent from environmental conditions because they're producing their own heat, right? So endothermy, using energy from their own metabolism, that is from their food, their fuel is food, to regulate body temperature. So it means they're more independent from the environment conditions because they're producing their own heat. They tend to have high body temperatures. In general, birds and mammals have body temperatures that are higher than the environmental temperature, often by as much as like 10 degrees Celsius or even more. Okay, so the body temperature tends to be warmer than the environment. And they have high metabolic rates, which I've already alluded to, right? So at the same body temperature, the basal metabolic rate of a mammal is 5 times higher than that of a lizard, an ectotherm, who's the same body size. So at rest, so that basal metabolic rate, right, for a mammal is 5 times higher than that of a lizard of the same body size, that lizard being an ectotherm. That's resting. At an active metabolic rate, it can be 10 to 30 times higher for the mammal than the lizard. So again, high metabolic rate. So there's a huge cost to this high metabolic rate. So the cost isn't from, endothermy per se. It's actually from this metabolic rate, this expensive metabolic rate. Okay, so huge cost. All right, so that leads to this general idea that it's really expensive to be an endotherm. This high metabolic rate requires a highly adapted anatomy, right, and and highly adapted physiology and behavior. So the animal has to be able to efficiently acquire, digest, and assimilate large amounts of food to fuel that furnace, right? They must efficiently deliver the energy, the nutrients, and the oxygen to the tissues, and they must efficiently remove any metabolic waste. They have to be super efficient. And all this means that they're going to have a large amount of investment into building really efficient organs to carry out these processes, okay? So large amounts of fuel and large investment into complex organ systems to be able to do all the things that have to happen to keep this high metabolic rate. So of course the benefit then of that is they can be active all the time, right? They can be active at night during cold weather. They can live in areas where reptiles and amphibians never could. Like think about in wintertime, you have those black-capped chickadees flying around in your yard being active. You would never imagine a 5-line skink lizard to be able to be out doing that, right? No lizard could feed alongside a black-capped chickadee in the winter, right? Chickadees, unlike the lizard, doesn't depend on the sun's radiation, right, to maintain its body temperature. But that said, the chickadee has to eat constantly to fuel that high metabolism in wintertime. Okay, so the multiple chemical reactions of metabolism, they're temperature sensitive, and we've talked about this before, right? The enzymes that catalyze reactions have these optimal temperatures that they work at. Warm temperatures will increase those reactions. And in general, those reactions, those enzymatic reactions, et cetera, metabolism in general, it's better coordinated when there's, a good constant thermal environment. And so that's that homeostasis piece that we talked about before, right? So this is especially true for endotherms who keep this constant internal temperature, and that's important to meet these high requirements of this high metabolism. Okay, We'll do a little bit of a comparison between birds and mammals here. So an endothermic animal is relatively independent of its environment, as I said, right? So it's relatively independent of its environmental temperatures because its body temperature is already warm because of that metabolic furnace. So in birds and mammals, this metabolic cost to maintaining endothermy is really expensive, as I said. So in fact, it requires up to 90% of the total metabolism is just devoted to this body temperature regulation, even more. So at least 90% of the total metabolism just goes to regulating body temperature, right? So let's, again, we'll compare some aspects of the physiological adaptations of birds and mammals. So birds have higher metabolic rates than mammals, as we saw in that graphic that I showed earlier. Birds tend to have really high body temperatures, from 38 to 42 degrees Celsius, tends to be a bit higher than mammals. Of course, birds have feathers for flight, but also insulation. So insulation is the piece we're interested in here because we're talking about thermoregulation. Of course, mammals have fur instead for insulation. The distribution of fat on a bird's body is different than the distribution of fat on a mammal's body, and this, presumably is birds fly, so we have to as we're thinking about it, we have to consider the aerodynamic adaptations that would be required for flight as well. Birds also incubate their eggs outside their bodies, which is not true for most mammals. Requires additional heat and results in exposure of parents to extreme thermal conditions, right? When a bird is sitting there incubating its egg, if you have ever seen the movie March of the Penguins, it's pretty incredible extreme thermal conditions that the adults are exposed to as they're taking care of their egg. Another aspect is that birds don't have sweat glands, right? So unlike mammals can sweat to dissipate some heat. Instead, birds lose heat through their respiratory system and through exposed skin, like on their legs, for example. And then the other thing is that birds have salt glands, and these are important for osmoregulation, helping to avoid dehydration from evaporative cooling, right? So they might want to cool off using evaporative cooling, but they also have salt glands that help to maintain osmoregulation. So like all vertebrate animals, birds have to maintain that internal homeostasis, right? In terms of their salt and their water content. And there has to be a balance, right? So water consumption has to match this evaporative water loss. There's a water budget, just like there was a heat budget that we talked about before. So this balance is maintained for birds. This osmoregulation is maintained by the kidneys, the lower GI tract, but also these salt glands are important here. And the salt glands are located in a depression of the skull that's near the eyes. And under some circumstances, these salt glands are more important than the kidneys even for osmoregulation. So for example, in seabirds, the only water available to them, right, is seawater, which is way salty. You can't drink seawater. And then even the food that they eat, they feed on invertebrates, and those invertebrates have a saline condition in their bodies that's just like salt water too. So that's not fresh water, right? So there's this constraint on getting fresh water. So this is all added to the problem of water loss from this evaporative cooling at high temperatures. There could be severe physiological stress, right? So these birds then use their salt glands for differential excretion of sodium ions and retention of water. So again, for some birds in some conditions, for example, seabirds, these salt glands are key, absolutely essential to maintaining that osmoregulation because they can't drink the salt water that's available, but then they're losing water if it's warm out through this evaporative cooling. So having these salt glands for this differential excretion of sodium ions is essential to maintain water balance. We also see, so that's an example in marine seabirds, but we also see these salt glands in desert species, which also makes sense, right? There's not a lot of water available. So ostriches and some desert raptors and some Arctic species also have these. I see some chat, so I'm going to go into the chat and see if there's some questions here. I have to move my screen around. Okay. Is it mammals who spend 90% of their energy to temperature regulations? Yes. So mammals and also birds, right? So endotherms in general, it's really expensive. And so they have to spend up to 90% of their energy just for temperature regulation. Okay. Okay. That's it. All right. Back to the discussion. Oh, looks like I have one more chat. Sorry, I'll check. Okay. All right. So that was about, again, a little bit about osmoregulation for birds. Okay, now back to metabolic rate. So basal metabolic rate, as a general rule, is related to body mass. Now, something to keep in mind is how you define this. So as body mass increases in general, metabolic rate does increase overall. But the key is that you have to think about it on a per unit mass. So larger birds actually expend less energy per unit mass than smaller birds. So again, overall body size, of course, as overall body size increases, metabolic rate is going to increase. But on a per gram basis, it actually decreases. That is, the smallest birds have the highest per unit mass metabolic rates. And so you can see that, for example, here in these species examples of birds. So we go from the largest bird species at the top to the smallest little hummingbird at the bottom. And here's the body mass of those organisms on average, so in kilograms, so 8.9 kilograms, down to this itty bitty little hummingbird, this rufous hummingbird. And when you tabulate the basal metabolic rate on a kilocalories per kilogram per day, you can see that the trumpeter swan has about 47 kilocalories, but the little hummingbird, 1,600 kilocalories per kilogram per day. So again, on a per unit mass, the little guy has a really high metabolic rate, right? The smallest birds have the highest per gram metabolic rates, okay? So there is that relationship to body mass. But there's other things that cause variation in basal metabolic rates of birds. So climate, for example, like latitude. So there tends to be a lower metabolic rate in tropical species compared to species at higher latitudes, those in more temperate zones. So like up here in Sudbury, we're in the temperate region, right? So there seems to be this impact of latitude. Again, lower metabolic rate in tropical species compared to species at higher latitudes and temperate zones. There seems to be an effect of season, tends to be a higher metabolic rate in winter than in summer. There's also an effect of natural history of the organism. So that is where they live. So nocturnal species active at night, tend to have lower metabolic rates than species active in the daytime, diurnal species. Habitat also seems to play a role. So marine species have higher metabolic rates than species that live in other types of habitats. So for some reason, marine species have higher metabolic rates. And we're gonna look at a couple of studies that have shown some data in support of this variation. And then also there's laboratory conditioning. So in the lab, you can measure metabolic rate, right, by using the respirometers. So metabolic rate increased from 10 up to 85% when you transfer a bird from a warm temperature to a cold temperature. So this goes to what we've talked about before as well about acclimation, right, acclimatization. So when you take an animal from a warm, happy temperature, 25 to 30 degrees Celsius, you take a bird and then you transfer it directly to a colder temperature. There's a fire up of its metabolic rate. So in general, what these data, these generalizations show is that cooler conditions seem to result in higher metabolic rates in birds. Not always, but there seems to be that pattern happening here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this study by McNabb that was published in Nature. You might know the journal Nature. This is one of the best journals that you can possibly publish in, has a really high impact factor. So as I've said many times, one of my goals for you all in this course is to learn about the scientific literature, learn how to write, but also learn how to read the scientific literature and glean stuff. So this article published in Nature, it's very short. It's a brief communication in Nature called Ecology Shapes Bird Bioenergetics. But it's a really good journal, so you know it's a really rock solid study. So in this study, that McNabb examined metabolic rate among 13 species from 9 different genera of birds of paradise, and they used respirometry to do this study. So they looked at basal metabolic rates, right, of these 13 species of birds, and uh, and showed basically that, so the sort of ultimate ending point is that if you combine these different aspects of body size, diet, and altitude, that explains almost all of the variation in metabolic rate among species. So in the previous slide, I was just talking about things that can impact basal metabolic rate. So here's an explicit experiment that was done on these 13 species that shows that body size, as you might expect, and diet, so there's a natural history component, and also altitude, so habitat where it lives, explains almost all of the variation in metabolic rate. So body size alone explains almost 92%. The diet of frugivores is lower than that of insectivores. So again, diet has an impact, and also altitude. So the high altitude species had higher basal metabolic rate than low altitude. This goes with the idea I mentioned before about cold temperature seems to elicit a higher metabolic rate. So again, interesting explicit test of some of these things that we're just mentioning in the previous slide as generalizations. And here's another study that looked at metabolism and evaporative water loss along an aridity gradient, so a dryness gradient, among several species of larks. So 12 species of lark. They looked at basal metabolic rate and also total evaporative water loss. And they found that among those species that basal metabolic rate and water loss decreased along a gradient of increasing aridity. So the punchline of this study was that when you combine this low basal metabolic rate and low evaporative water loss, those are favorable things to have in these dry, arid environments. This is adaptive because it reduces the food and water required and minimizes heat production, right? If you're living in a hot, dry desert, right, it would be really good if you weren't losing all your water, right? So it shows that adaptation. So as predicted, the basal metabolic rate and evaporative water loss decreased along a gradient of increasing hot dryness. And this indicates, again, adaptation. Birds in the arid environment had reduced basal metabolic rates and reduced water loss, which makes sense, right? Okay, so if you think about that, right, like a combination of that low metabolic rate and low water loss, that would be advantageous for birds that are in these hot, dry, desert type environments because it's going to reduce the food and water requirements. If they have a lower furnace to fuel, right? If they have a lower basal metabolic rate, that's going to reduce the amount of energy, the amount of food they need. And if they have a lower water loss, then that's going to reduce the amount of water they need. So that would be good. And it's going to minimize heat production. So those are adaptive traits, right? And this study supports that idea. So again, the study tested this hypothesis that basal metabolic rate and evaporative water loss are going to be reduced along this aridity gradient as an adaptation for energy efficiency in this hot, dry environment, right? And this hypothesis is related to the productivities of the environment. So when you have high aridity, right, when you have a desert type environment, there's less water there available, there's less food available, and there's higher temperatures. So overall, that means it's a low productivity environment. There's not a lot of resources available in terms of food and water, as opposed to a more moist or xeric environment where there's going to be more water available, more food available, right? That's a higher productivity environment. And so they used respirometry to test this hypothesis among these 12 species of lark. And so I pulled from the paper this graphic, figure 1, that I think is really great for explaining these patterns in a data form, right? So this figure shows the mass adjusted basal metabolic rate and then the total evaporative water loss for these 12 species of lark as a function of environmental aridity. So what I did, so they created this aridity index along the x-axis, and so I've plotted here for you the words dry to wet. So this goes from more desert to more xeric type environments, right? And then on the lower panel, we have evaporative water loss, total evaporative water loss. On the upper panel, we have that basal metabolic rate. And it's pretty clear. So, and each dot, right, is the average for a species. So multiple birds of a given species. So you can see there's several species, right? 12 species here. And then they fitted a regression line. So the biological interpretation, right, is that as it gets wetter, then the metabolic rate goes up. As it gets wetter, the evaporative water loss rate goes up. So again, their interpretation here is that these low metabolic rates in dry conditions this low evaporative water loss in dry conditions is adaptive in these low productivity environments among these species of lark. So again, a good paper that shows support for that idea. Okay. Now, to maintain body temperature, the physiological and the metabolic reactions that produce heat have to be balanced against the things that radiate and conduct heat away. So remember that frog picture that we had a couple lectures ago about heat budgets, right? So all the physiological and metabolic reactions, especially in an endotherm, right? They produce heat. Those have to be balanced against the heat that's taken away. So there has to be a heat budget. Okay. So this graphic is showing the thermal neutral zone for birds as an example. So on the x-axis, we have the ambient temperature. So the A means ambient, so air temperature. On the y-axis, we have metabolic rate measured as the volume of oxygen consumption. So we're using respirometry in this example. So VO2 means oxygen consumption. Okay. And then we have a few things going on here. So the blue line is the body temperature of the bird. So TB is body temperature. The red line is basal metabolic rate. The gray box is thermal neutral zone. So I mentioned this a bit earlier when I was talking about an animal in its happy temperature range. So this is bounded by a lower critical temperature and an upper critical temperature. So you should recognize this terminology from when we talked about tolerance curves, right? There's a lower temperature that's below that, it's problematic. There's an upper temperature, and above that, things get a bit problematic, right? Okay. So again, lower critical temperature, upper critical temperature related to that tolerance curve. Okay. And so then we can look at this, the red line, this basal metabolic rate, as basically as heat production, right? When we're talking about an endotherm. Okay. So in this gray box, this thermal neutral zone, the rate of oxygen consumption is it's flat, right? It's pretty flat. It's relatively constant. The bird doesn't need to expend any energy to maintain its body temperature. Flat line here, happy basal metabolic rate. Flat line here, happy body temperature, where the animal is comfortable, where it needs to be. Okay, so again, remembering that this red line equals energy, right? So at this end of the graphic, when we have an animal that gets above its upper critical temperature, it needs to get rid of that heat now so that it doesn't overheat. It needs to do something to maintain its body temperature. So it uses active heat dissipation. And we're going to talk about methods that birds use to do that, like panting and stuff. And so we'll come back to that. But basically, when the environmental temperature goes above that upper critical temperature, there's increased heat production from increased body temperature, and that has to be dissipated. The animal has to do something. And so you can see that there's an increase in its basal metabolic rate that it invests to actively dissipate the heat to be able to keep that flat line for its body temperature. But there's at some point when it can't do it anymore and body temperature starts to go up, and then it's in trouble, right? So it can do some active heat dissipation to deal with this temperature above its upper critical, but only up until a certain point, and then the mechanisms fail and things kind of go off the rails and body temperature goes up, and then it's in trouble. So the slope of this line is basically telling you the cost of thermoregulation in a hot environment. This is right. Basal metabolic rate represents this cost. So this upswing in basal metabolic rate is what it costs this bird to maintain its body temperature at a good rate. And then like I said, at some point it goes off the rails and it can't do it anymore. So now if we go to the lower end, when the body temperature or when the environmental temperature goes below that lower critical temperature, now the animal has to do something to produce heat, right? It has to do something to keep that nice, good, flat body temperature that it wants to be at. So again, the slope of the line, there's a cost here to this additional heat production. So this is things like shivering, and we'll talk more about that too, right? So the animal can shiver, and then it increases its metabolic rate to maintain that flat body temperature. And then again, there's a cold temperature at which this goes off the rails as well, and it can't do it anymore, and body temperature goes down. Okay, so these are the costs of maintaining that constant body temperature when things get warm and when things get cold. So the efficiency of this warming method, shivering, for example, it really depends on the body size of the bird as well. Small birds are better at shivering than large birds, and we're going to come back to that. It has to do with body mass. Okay, so again, this thermal neutral zone, flat body temperature, flat basal metabolic rate, getting outside that thermal neutral zone to be able to maintain that flat body temperature, that flat line of body temperature, that constant body temperature. The animal needs to do something, and that costs the animal, right? An increase in its metabolic rate to be able to do that. Okay, so what are factors that are going to affect heat transfer? So I mentioned smaller birds, right? That can do some of these mechanisms, and large birds can't. So smaller birds have a large surface area to volume ratio compared to a big bird, right? Like a little chickadee versus a big raven. Okay, so smaller birds then have greater heat loss because they have a bigger surface area relative to their little body volume, right? So lots of surface area to lose heat. So small birds in a cold environment have a pretty huge task of maintaining their body temperature. Okay, so there's this is one of the main factors affecting heat transfer, is this surface area to volume ratio. There's also non-evaporative heat transfer, which can occur by 3 different processes. And we've talked a little bit about these before already. So the first is solar radiation, right? This is the direct or reflected radiation. It can be reflected off things in the environment. So this is the transfer of heat by the electromagnetic radiation, the solar radiation, but without direct contact between the bird's body and surfaces in the environment, right? You already know that that's conduction. Okay, so again, solar radiation, just receiving that solar radiation from the sun. So the bird gains heat if the temperature of its surroundings is higher than its skin or its feathers, right? So the hot solar radiation, if that's warmer than the bird's body temperature, the bird's going to take in that heat. The second is convection, and we mentioned this before on that frog picture. Convection involves the actual movement of molecules in the air, right? So a circulating fluid. So the transfer of heat contained in a mass of gas or a mass of liquid by movement of the molecules in that mass, right? So wind is an example, right? High wind speeds tend to increase metabolic heat production, and that's shown here in this little graphic. So here's wind speed. We have a lower wind speed and a higher wind speed. So we have no wind basically here, and then this 2 meters per second wind. And here on the y-axis, we have metabolic heat production. So you can see there's an increase in that heat production when the wind speed goes up. Okay, so again, that's convection. And then third is conduction, and this is the one where there's heat transfer by direct contact, right? So transfer between objects that are in direct contact. So an animal in direct contact with a substrate like a soil or a rock, remembering again that frog picture. And then other things, of course, that will affect how heat is transferred for a bird have to do with the feathers, the plumage. So the feathers provide some insulation. And then the fourth one is evaporative heat loss, right? And so there's 3 things here to mention, and we're going to talk more about them on the next slide. So again, birds have no sweat glands, as I mentioned, unlike mammals. There's also gular fluttering, respiratory evaporative heat loss, and then across the skin surface as well. Okay, so some ways that birds, we're going to talk about ways that birds can stay cool and ways that birds can warm up. So overheating is a really big deal for birds. Overheating is more stressful than cooling for birds. So evaporative cooling for birds is limited, though, because they don't have sweat glands, right? So evaporative cooling is limited to the respiratory system. They can't sweat. So one thing they can do is this gular flutter. So gular is the throat area, right? So they can do a rapid fluttering of the throat area or the buccal area, which results in evaporative heat loss from the mucous membranes of the throat. And this has been observed in several different bird species like pelicans and cormorants and turkey vultures, roadrunners, which live in the desert, right, of the Southwest, goat suckers, that's nighthawks, and whippoorwills, both of which live here in Sudbury, right? So this gular flutter, again, is this rapid movement of the mucous membranes of the throat that allows for evaporative cooling. Birds can also pant. So there's a picture of a swallow here. He's got his mouth open so he can pant and again do this gaping where he's going to lose some heat from evaporative water loss across the throat. Some other ways to stay cool. So remembering that the birds are covered in feathers, right? So one thing they can do is a behavioral way by holding their wings up and away from their body, which is going to expose the thinner feathers that are in their armpit areas, right? So under the wings, there's fewer feathers, so the heat can escape through those less insulated areas. Another way is to go find a shady spot and rest in that shady spot during the hottest, sunniest part of the day. And so also, that relates to avoiding direct sunlight. Another example is, for example, during egg incubation, when the parent is exposed, herring gulls, for example, orient the white part of their body, their white plumage, to the sun. Because if you remember that discussion about albedo, right, solar radiation is reflected off white things. And so if they orient their white feathers towards the sun during egg incubation, that's going to reflect the heat off, not exposing their blacker body parts to the sun, which would then absorb the heat. I think I saw a chat, so I'm just going to just check and see if there's a question in the chat there. Does Gular fluttering ever make a sound? That I don't actually know, because I've never observed it, listened to it myself. But I wonder if you could Google that and figure it out for us, Cameron. Okay. So ways to get warm. So ways to stay cool, we talked about. Again, it's super stressful overheating for birds. So they need to, that's a big deal, and they don't have sweat glands. So it's a big deal for them to figure out ways to stay cool. Now we'll talk about ways to stay warm. And so the primary means that I already mentioned is this shivering, right? So the primary means for increasing heat production in birds is shivering. And I talk more about this in the winter ecology course that I teach next semester. So the large flight muscles, those pectoralis muscles, as well as some of the larger leg muscles, are really important for generating heat by shivering. And again, I'm not going to get into too many details. If you want to know more, take winter ecology. Of course, the feathers, the plumage, provides insulation, and the number of feathers varies seasonally, with more during the winter than during the summer. And then birds can also, fluff up their feathers in cold weather. So the dermal muscles contract and raise the feathers, creating a space that then traps warm air. And this provides insulation. Air is really great for trapping heat. So this is just like why in the winter you would wear a down coat, or why you would have a down sleeping bag or a down duvet on your bed, right? All that air provides insulation because of the way heat moves through air. Okay. And then there's also three other ones here that we're going to go through. So countercurrent blood flow, behavior, and then hypothermia or torpor. So the next one is this countercurrent blood flow. So birds that live in cold environments have to conserve their body heat to avoid hypothermia. So blood that flows from the body core to the periphery, like to the legs and feet, it has a lot of heat in it, right? It's coming from the body core where it's really warm. And because those legs don't have any plumage on them, and because they're long, thin, skinny sticks, they have a really high surface area to volume ratio, right? So there's no insulation, and there's this high surface area to volume ratio, which means heat's just going to be lost like crazy across the legs, right? So heat can easily be lost across the skin. So what a waste if all that core body heat gets down to the legs and then just disappears, right? That's a big waste of the bird's energy. So to avoid this kind of heat loss, birds use this countercurrent blood flow. So this countercurrent exchange of heat in the blood vessels of the legs. So the arteries and the veins that run through the legs are in really close proximity to each other. And what this means is that heat can be recaptured as it's moving. So you have the warm arterial blood. So this is the core of the bird's body. So the bird is lying down in this picture instead of standing up. But we have the warm arterial blood from the core of the body. And then here we have the foot. It's down at this end, the feet of the bird, and the cold temperature is here. So this is the leg of the bird. So we have the warm arterial blood flowing, and then the blood going back to the veins. So what happens is, because these blood vessels are in close contact, heat can be transferred, right? The heat moves to the colder area. And so what that means is that you end up with a gradient of temperature across the leg. So it's warmer here and it's colder down here at the foot, right? So the warm blood, the arterial warm blood from the body core entering the limbs gives up some of its heat to the cool blood that's returning from the tip of the foot. And so this heat is returned to the body core then, right? You're conserving the heat up here closer to the body core. So it keeps the core warm and the extremities end up being cool. And so although the heat is transferred, right, the good thing is the blood is still flowing. So all the nutrients and oxygen and everything are still flowing through and getting to those extremities, even though the heat is being recaptured here. So of course, why this is really important is that if you have a bird who's got cold feet standing on a cold surface like ice, it's going to lose very little heat by conduction because there's not much of a temperature gradient now between the bird's foot and the ice it's standing on, right? If you remember, conduction is one of the ways to transfer heat. If this bird's foot was 38 degrees Celsius while it's standing on a 0 degrees Celsius block of ice, that's a super steep temperature gradient. So the heat would just be sucked right out of that bird's foot. But because it's created this gradient of temperature across its foot, now the bird's foot is maybe just a few degrees Celsius warmer than the ice, which is a less steep, a very shallow gradient of temperature. So there's very little heat loss. So this is a way that a bird can stand on ice and not lose a bunch of heat from its body because the heat is kept up here in the core. So I hope that makes sense. I think that's an absolutely fascinating physiological adaptation. Okay, another way to stay warm is through behavioral means. So for example, huddling, for example, in emperor penguins. Again, if you watch March of the Penguins, you'll see something about this. So this huddling, so in groups, they can keep heat together. Use changes in posture, so the head and limbs can get tucked into the plumage. So I just mentioned about these long, skinny legs being sticks without any plumage and all kinds of surface area to their volume. So if they can, you see a bird standing sometimes and it tucks one leg up, like this guy here, into his plumage, and now there's only one stick leg that's going to be losing heat. But again, there's going to be that gradient along here, and the tip of his foot standing on this ice is going to be quite cool relative to the start of the leg up near the body core, which will be warm. Like huddling, also communal roosts can be used. Also seeking favorable microsites, for example, willow ptarmigan, they might burrow in the snow for up to 21 hours a day during extremely cold weather. The snow is a great big blanket to keep warmth from the soil. And so the animal may dive down into the snow and hold up there because the air is much colder than down in that snow area. Again, we'll talk more about that in winter ecology if you want to take that. And then also, somebody asked about this last time, migration too. Just, some birds just leave and go to warmer places. Okay. And then the fifth way to stay warm is to use hypothermia, to actually let their bodies go into hypothermia. So some birds, particularly small birds that depend on seasonal food like nectar and insects, they have to allow their body temperature to fall below normal levels at certain times of the year when these food items and nectar and insects are not available. So in the winter, for example. But there's two types of this hypothermia. There's a daily version and then there's a seasonal version. Okay. So hypothermia in general is triggered by food availability or, depletion maybe of stored reserves. So some birds actually cache food, like whiskey jacks, gray jays, for example. So hypothermia can be triggered by this reduced food availability or depletion of any energy stores. So the reason for doing this hypothermia is to save energy. And again, there's two major categories in birds. There's nocturnal or daily hypothermia or torpor, and then there's seasonal. So nocturnal hypothermia, it helps the bird conserve energy during the cold nights when it can't feed. Okay, and then seasonal torpor, which allows the bird to reduce its rates of energy consumption by 10 to 60% during winter. Okay, so this again, there's a daily torpor and then there's a seasonal torpor. Okay, so during nocturnal hypothermia, so this daily version, so the body temperature can drop by as much as 8 to 10 degrees Celsius, which if you think for an endotherm, that's pretty serious stuff, right? Endotherms, homeotherms keep temperature constant. So allowing the body temperature to go down by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius is a significant change, right? And there's not a heck of a lot known about how they do this, about the physiological mechanisms that allow birds to do this. But evidence suggests that this torpor is probably quite a bit like sleep. The heat production decreases and the body cools passively. So what this would mean is that there has to be some mechanism that prevents the bird from shivering because the physiological reaction to a cooling condition is for the muscles to start shivering to produce heat. So for birds to be able to do this nighttime torpor, there has to be a way to prevent that shivering from happening. So the body cooling is facilitated by somehow preventing shivering from happening. And there's this passive cooling of the body. So it's not like the bird says, oh, I need to cool off my body. It's a passive cooling that happens. And the rate of entry into torpor is inversely related to body mass. So as I mentioned, that it only works for small animals, so for small birds, because rewarming in the morning is achieved by vigorous shivering. So the shivering is allowed, the mechanism kicks back in for warming up. And this rate of rewarming is related to body mass. Like a great big raven could not rewarm fast enough to get active in the short daylight, kind of thing. So, this daily torpor is restricted to little birds. Big birds would take too long to cool down and then too long to warm back up. So daily torpor is restricted to small-bodied species. And then there's also variation for different species about how they can tolerate, for how low of a body temperature they can tolerate. For example, nightjars, which is one of the goat suckers that's related to the whippoorwills and nighthawks that we have here, their body temperatures can go as low as 5 to 8 degrees Celsius, which is just incredible in my mind. And of course, that low of a temperature would be totally lethal for a hummingbird. A hummingbird would not be able to pull that off. So again, this nocturnal or this daily torpor, this going into this torpor at nighttime, it's restricted to small-bodied birds because of this passive cooling and then shivering to warm back up for the daytime. Big birds wouldn't be able to do it. There's just too much body to be able to pull that off. So that, again, restricted to small birds. I think I saw a chat, so I'm going to go up here and check a question perhaps in the chat. We tend to associate hypothermia with being too cold, but if it's triggered by significant energy loss, then we could, in theory, go into hypothermia without cold temperatures. Oh, wow, Darwin. Let's see. Being too cold, but if it's triggered by significant energy loss. I don't know the answer to that. What a great question. Right. So yeah, it's triggered by a lack of food, a lack of energy. So I don't know. That's a really great question, but you'd have to figure out an experiment to disentangle temperature from energy resources and then maybe test it. So you probably could test that in a respirometry type situation, because you could use the respirometry to measure energy and then subject the animals to different temperatures in a closed system. I think you could probably test it, but I don't know off the top of my head. Okay. All right. I think somebody else, it's hypothermia. Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm going to go to an example here of seasonal torpor for a hummingbird, a tiny little creature. So here we have on the x-axis, we have air temperature, and on the y-axis, we have metabolic rate measured indirectly as oxygen consumption. And then we have an active hummingbird, and then we have a hummingbird that's in torpor. Okay, so this is seasonal torpor. So what's important here is, again, this is a method of conserving energy during winter. So this is seasonal torpor. So what happens is a temperature-independent metabolic depression during torpor. So when I say it's temperature independent, it means that temperature is not what's driving the change in metabolic rate. Somehow it's decoupled from that temperature. So this example here, if we take, for example, 10 degrees Celsius, and we look at the metabolic rate of an active, summer active hummingbird, at 10 degrees Celsius, the metabolic rate is 10 centimeters cubed per gram per hour, right? But in this animal that's in seasonal torpor, and we do the same thing, it's 10 degrees Celsius still, but it's temperature independent now, depression of metabolism, because we see that now the metabolic rate of this animal is only 3 centimeters cubed per gram per hour. So we say it's a temperature independent because we're measuring it at just this single temperature. This active animal, this summer active animal, metabolic rate is 10. For the torpid animal, the metabolic rate is only 3 at that given temperature. Excuse me. Okay. So metabolic rate for these animals in seasonal torpor, it can go as low as 1/3 of what basal metabolic rate. So it's quite an amazing drop in metabolic rate, down to as low as 1/3 of basal metabolic rate. And this substantial drop in metabolic rate or respiratory rate, because we're measuring it using respirometry, the breathing rate goes to as low as 1 to 2 breaths per minute, just 1 to 2 breaths per minute, from rates as high as like 300 to 400 breaths per minute during the active season for hummingbirds, right? Hummingbirds just are such speedy little metabolic furnaces, right? So from 300 to 400 breaths per minute during the active season, down to 1 to 2 breaths per minute when it's in torpor. And then the heart rate also goes down. So an active rate for the heartbeat of a hummingbird is about 500 beats per minute. And then in a torpid hummingbird, it's only about 30 beats per minute. So amazing reductions in breathing rate and also heart rate. And in some species, the body temperature goes below 10 degrees Celsius, which is phenomenal. Okay, so I have another question, it looks like, in the chat. Yeah, so the nocturnal torpor is the I guess, margin of temperature dip by 8 to 10 degrees of their normal temp, or does it go down to 8 to 10 degrees temperature? So it's a decline. So for nocturnal hyperthermia, yes, nocturnal hypothermia, the body temperature can decline by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. Not that the animal's body is as low as 8 to 10 degrees Celsius in that particular example. So there can be a drop by as much as 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. But that said, it's sort of the answer is both, actually, because some birds vary in their tolerance of low temperatures. So I gave the example of the nightjar, for example, who lets their body temperature get as low as 8 degrees Celsius, which is much lower than some other birds can handle. So it's both. In nocturnal torpor, some birds will let their body temperature go down by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. In other animals, the actual body temperature they experience is as low as 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. So I hope that answers your question, Kiana. Okay. All right. So then back to this idea about seasonal torpor. What about birds that don't use seasonal torpor? So in cold weather, if you're a non-torpid bird, they must be operating at well above their basal metabolic rate. So think back to that thermal neutral zone graph, right? That increased metabolic rate that happens at cold temperatures, right? And it only goes so far. So they have to increase their metabolic rate to maintain their body temperature. So again, thinking about what's happening on the left-hand side of that thermal neutral zone graph. So small species like black-capped chickadees, they overwinter here in Sudbury, right? They're active all winter long. So they're active in temperate and subarctic areas, and they're at particular risk of freezing because they're little, right? They have a pretty large surface area to volume ratio. So basically, the bottom line is chickadees have to eat continuously during the short daylight hours just to keep alive during each one of those nights, during each one of those daily torpors. So if they don't, they won't have enough energy reserves to see them through the long, cold night. So, and I talk again more about this in winter ecology. I don't want to steal too much thunder from that course here, just touching on things maybe to get you excited to take winter ecology. But the bottom line there is keep your feeders full with black oil sunflower seed during the winter time so the chickadees can fuel up all day long and make it through the night, those cold Sudbury nights. Okay, so the summary of the things that we talked about today. So the unique features of the thermoregulatory physiology of birds. So in general, birds tend to have relatively high core body temperatures, higher than that of mammals. They tend to have quite high metabolic rates. Their basal metabolic rate for the passerine birds especially is the highest that was on that graphic when we compared. We looked at some studies to show that there's variation in metabolic rate with different features. So for example, with body size, there's variation in metabolic rate, with the smallest birds having the highest per unit mass metabolic rate. We also saw that diet has an effect on metabolic rate, comparing fruit-eating birds to insectivorous birds. We saw that altitude also had an effect, higher metabolic rate at higher altitudes, that is at colder temperatures, right? And we also looked at the study of their aridity gradient. In the really hot, dry conditions, there's a lower metabolic rate and lower evaporative water loss because it's a lower productivity environment. So they're maintaining energy and not, they're reducing their energy requirements in those lower productivity environments compared to higher productivity xeric environments that are wetter and lusher, have more food, more water. Birds don't have sweat glands, which presents some interesting challenges for them to cool off, and overheating is a serious problem for birds. It's more troublesome than cold conditions, so they have some mechanisms to cool off, like Gular flutter, and they can also use some behavioral things like finding cooler places and lifting up their wings to expose the less insulated armpit areas. And then in terms of worrying about heat loss when it's cold out, they have, of course, their feathers. They have, and then seasonally they'll get more feathers in the wintertime. They have that incredible countercurrent blood flow in their legs so that they don't lose heat by conduction when their skinny, naked legs are standing on cold surfaces. And then finally, we talked about daily and seasonal torpor, this ability to let themselves go into hypothermia on a daily basis for some small birds, and then seasonally for some other birds that just sort of shut down for the wintertime. Okay, and that's it for today's lecture. I will wait a few minutes to see if people have questions in the chat. So it's just 11 minutes after 11, so we have a bit of time if people have some questions. Go ahead and post them. I did have a question earlier about the lab. So, you know, thinking about if you don't have a bean soup mix to bring, you could maybe bring other things like candies that are varied in size and shape, like Skittles and jelly beans and other things mixed together. And then, of course, you get to eat them after, so that makes it a little bit more fun. And then for those of you, so it's raining outside, or it was raining. I don't know if it still is. I'm trying to look up my office window here, but you know, going out in the grass would be fun to do the exercise. But if you can't do that, we did a pilot run using just sort of bed sheets all crumpled up to make a surface, so you could do that if you want to do it indoors. And again, come with as many of the implements, the tools for collecting beans as possible, because we're going to assign them out. And I have set up the breakout rooms in the lab with your GTAs. I have a pilot run with the GTAs after the lecture today. We're going to see if those breakout rooms work okay. So again, it's a work in progress. I'm hoping it all works out. You will have one GTA give you the pre-lab lecture, and then you'll go into your breakout rooms with your individual TAs. But the TAs have decided that what they'd like to do is have one TA give the pre-lab talk to the whole group, the whole class, in case there's common questions among the different lab sections. And then after that pre-lab talk is given and the questions are answered, then you will go into your breakout rooms. Caroline asks if the links are on D2L. So the lab meeting link should be in D2L in the calendar section. And then the breakout room is something that I do as the host once we are all in D2L. So we're going again, I'm going to give that a go with the TAs at noon, and we're going to see if hopefully it all works out. Hopefully it all works out. If it doesn't, then I guess we'll just do the first lab as one big group, which is not the best, but we'll try it. And remember that today's lab has the second exercise that you're to do on your own time, and that is the exercise that you do to make your table, to hand in for marking. So you do the peppered moth exercise on your own time. Are there any other questions about lecture content or about the first lab this afternoon, the first lab activity that we're doing this afternoon? Not having a camera on your computer, no, that should not be a problem.
I haven't seen a Dropbox for the table yet.
Yeah, it's not due today though, right? It's due next week.
Already done.
Already done. Awesome. It's due next week. So Caroline asked, we don't submit a table for the bean activity. The bean activity there's a data collection page on the last page of it. So you will be doing that as well, but the table that's going to be marked is the one from the peppered moth exercise. I don't know. Chloe asked how long the lab's going to be. I don't know. We have 3 hours to do it. We'll see how long it takes to do it with this first online activity. So I can't say for sure how long it's going to be. It should not be the full 3 hours though. All right. Any other questions? I have another minute or two. All right. Okay, everybody, I'll see you later on at the lab.